I've always thought of my life in two halves, before the accident and the long, static after. Before, I was a man of motion, an architect who lived on adrenaline, scaffolding, and the visceral thrill of seeing steel skeletons rise against a city skyline. I was 6 feet tall, obsessed with the physics of height, the tension of high tensile cables, and the structural integrity of cantilevered glass. I lived for the way a building could catch the dying light at 5 p.m., a monument to human will, and I carried that same arrogance in my own body. I moved through the world as if I were one of my own designs, sleek, functional, and permanent. I took up space with a casual confidence, my footsteps echoing in half-finished lobbies, my hands constantly sketching lines of ascent on napkins and tablet screens. I also had Sarah. She didn't just love me, she loved the idea of me. She loved the version of me that was always climbing, the man who stood on the covers of trade magazines with a hard hat and a look of calculated defiance. To Sarah, our marriage was an architectural marvel in its own right, a structure built on high-altitude galas, coastal trails, and the status that came with being the wife of the city's most sought-after builder. She loved the power in my legs as we navigated crowded social circuits, and she especially loved the way I could sweep her up in a crowded room, spinning her until she laughed, the world a blur of motion that we controlled together. We were vertical people. We lived in a penthouse with floor-to-ceiling glass, looking down on the world as if it were a scale model we had already mastered. We didn't know how to exist on any other plane. But when the car hydroplaned on a slick October night and my spine shattered like cheap glass against the pavement, the world stopped spinning. My structural integrity was gone. My world collapsed into the four walls of a hospital room, and then into the clinical confines of a house redesigned for wheels, lower counters, wider doors, and the constant humiliating presence of strangers who saw me as a series of tasks rather than a man. The vertical world I had built was suddenly out of reach, replaced by a horizontal existence of ceilings, bed rails, and low-angle perspectives. I was no longer a creator of heights. I was a tenant of the floor. The narrative of why Sarah left didn't start with a bang. It started with a slow, agonizing erosion of her own self-image. In the hospital, I watched the light go out in her eyes the first time a nurse asked her to help change my sheets. I saw her hand tremble, not with grief, but with a visceral, jagged revulsion when she saw the surgical scars and the tubes that now tethered me to life. She began to stay later and later at her gallery, claiming she was working, but I knew she was just avoiding the aesthetic of my brokenness. She couldn't handle the way the smell of sterile hospital soap replaced my cedarwood cologne. She couldn't handle that her achievement of a husband had been downgraded into a tragedy. She saw my paralysis as a personal betrayal, a breach of contract she never intended to honor. 3 months into my recovery, Sarah stood at the foot of my bed. She didn't cry. She looked at me with a distance that hurt worse than the initial impact. She told me she couldn't be a glorified servant to a man who was only half there. "I didn't sign up for this, Harry," she whispered, her voice cold as steel. "I married a titan. I can't spend the rest of my life emptying bags and measuring out pills. It's not the life we built." She said she was grieving for the man I used to be, as if I were already dead and buried while I was still drawing breath. She couldn't reconcile the ruins in front of her with the skyscraper she had married. She left the divorce papers next to my bedside table and walked out of my life, leaving a silence so heavy I thought it would suffocate me. In her eyes, the building had collapsed, and she wasn't interested in the reconstruction. She wanted a new plot of land, somewhere higher and less complicated. The agency sent Kenneth on a humid Tuesday morning. I was in a foul mood, the kind where the phantom itch in my non-responsive feet haunt like a personal insult from the universe. I sat in my chair by the window, watching the dust motes dance in the light, feeling like just another piece of furniture gathering dust. When the doorbell rang, I maneuvered my chair to the entry, bracing for the usual look of glazed-over professional sympathy, the kind that treats you like a project rather than a person. But Kenneth didn't look at the chair. He looked at my eyes, and for a second I felt the air leave my lungs. He was tall, with shoulders that seemed to pull all the light in the room toward him. His skin was the color of deep, polished mahogany, and he carried himself with a quiet, grounded strength that filled the hallway. He didn't smell like bleach or latex. He smelled like rain, cedarwood, and something warm and living. He stood there with a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, looking at me not as a disaster area, but as a site with potential. He didn't flinch at my scars or my scowl. "Harry?" he asked, his voice a low, resonant hum that I felt vibrate deep in my own rib cage, a frequency that seemed to bypass my ears and hit me directly in the center of my chest. "The one and only," I snapped, my voice raspy from disuse. "The manual for my maintenance is on the island. My ex-wife left a list of my failures there, too, if you're looking for light reading. It's categorized by what I can't do and what I'll never do again. I suggest you start with the never section. It's the longest. It covers everything from dancing to basic dignity." Kenneth didn't flinch. He didn't offer a platitude or a forced smile. He simply walked past me, closed the door with a soft, final thud, and leaned against the counter. "I'm not much for manuals, Harry, and I don't care about lists written by people who aren't here. How about we just figure out how you like to live? I'm not here to manage a failure. I'm here to work with a man. I've seen broken things before, and usually they're the ones with the most interesting foundations." The intimacy began in small, terrifying increments. The first time he had to shave me, he didn't just stand back with an electric razor. He brought a leather pouch containing a straight blade. He tilted my head back, his warm, large hand cupping my jaw with a firm gentleness that made my heart hammer against my ribs. He applied the warm cream with a soft brush, the bristles tickling my skin, and then he leaned in close, so close I could see the golden flecks in his dark irises. He didn't speak, he just worked. The scrape of the blade against my throat was a sound of absolute trust I wasn't ready to give, but as he wiped the stray foam from my lip with the pad of his thumb, his eyes lingered on my mouth for a fraction of a second too long. I felt a spark, a phantom tingle that had nothing to do with my spine and everything to do with the man standing between my knees. He didn't pull away immediately. He stayed there, his breath ghosting over my skin until the air in the room felt thick enough to drown in. I found myself looking at the pulse in his own neck, wondering if his heart was racing as fast as mine. Then came the first bath. Being naked in front of a stranger usually made me feel most humiliated, a sharp reminder of the revolting reality Sarah had fled from. I expected clinical detachment. I expected him to look over me, not at me, as if I were a car being washed in a tunnel. But as Kenneth lowered the hoist into the sandalwood-scented water, the atmosphere shifted. He didn't use a rough cloth or move with the hurried efficiency of the nurses before him. He used his palms. He started with my shoulders, kneading the chronic tension out with a slow, rhythmic heat. When he reached my chest, his touch lingered, his fingers tracing the lines of my ribs with a curiosity that felt dangerously like affection. He lifted my legs, dead weight to me but precious cargo to him, and washed them with a reverence that made my throat tight. He would slide his soapy hand under my thigh, his arm brush against my skin, and for the first time since the accident, I didn't feel like a broken machine. I felt like a man being worshipped in the steam. It wasn't just cleaning, it was a reclamation of my flesh.
By the second month, the clinical boundaries were dissolving entirely, replaced by a strange, magnetic pull. Kenneth introduced range of motion exercises that felt less like physical therapy and more like a slow, deliberate dance. He was meticulous, his focus so absolute that it made the rest of the world fade away. He would move my limbs with a precision that was almost hypnotic, narrating the movement as if he were trying to teach my brain to find my body again, one joint at a time. One afternoon, he brought a bottle of warmed apricot oil. "The skin on your legs is getting dry, Harry," he said, his voice dropping to that low, tectonic frequency. He laid me on the bed, stripped to my boxers, and began the session. This wasn't just stretching. He poured the oil into his palms, rubbing them together until the scent of stone fruit filled the room. When he first pressed his hands to my shins, the heat was electric. He worked his way up, his thumbs digging into the atrophy of my thighs with a strength that suggested he was trying to massage life back into the dead nerves. I watched him, my breath catching as his hands moved higher, the oil making his grip slick and incredibly intimate. He didn't stop at my knees. He worked the inner line of my thighs, his knuckles grazing the fabric of my underwear. I felt my face flush, my heart pounding against the mattress. I wanted him to keep going, and I wanted him to stop before I lost my mind. He looked up, his eyes dark and dilated. He didn't pull back. Instead, he leaned over me, his hands still anchored to my legs. "You're trembling, Harry," he whispered. "Is it too much?" "No," I managed to choke out, my voice barely a threat. It's exactly enough. Don't stop." The silence that followed was heavy with everything we weren't saying. He continued the massage, his touch becoming slower, more deliberate, until the boundary between care and desire was nothing more than a memory. When he finally finished, he didn't just walk away. He pulled the covers up over me, his hand lingering on my hip for a heartbeat, and the look he gave me was enough to keep me awake for 3 nights. Our first real date grew out of that afternoon. Kenneth insisted on taking me to the pier near the old lighthouse. I had avoided the ocean for 3 years. The vast, moving horizon felt like a graveyard for the man I used to be. I remembered how Sarah used to complain about the spectacle of the ramp, making me feel like an anchor she was forced to drag. "I've got you, Harry," Kenneth said, as the pavement turned to rough wooden slats. He stopped the chair and wrapped a heavy indigo wool blanket around my legs, tucking the corners in with a meticulous tenderness that felt like a silent promise. He knelt for a moment, his hands resting on my shins as he looked up at me. "Trust me, I won't let you roll off the edge." "Against my better judgment," I whispered, but I was smiling. We sat at the edge of the pier for hours, watching the gray Atlantic churn. He'd brought a thermos of tea and 2 real china cups. It was such a small, civilized detail, yet it felt like a grand rebellion against my sterile plastic and latex life. "Why do you do this?" I asked, the wind whipping my hair. "Stay late, bring the good tea, take me to places that are a logistical nightmare?" Kenneth turned to me, his dark eyes steady. "Because I don't see a chair when I look at you, Harry. I see the man who designed the glass tower on 5th Avenue. I see the guy who gets frustrated when the light isn't perfect. I see the guy who still has a hell of a lot of architecture left in his soul. The chair is just the pedestal, it isn't the statue. And honestly, I like the way you look when you're arguing with me. It's the most alive thing I've ever seen." One rainy afternoon shortly after, we were stuck inside. The sound of the rain against the skylight was rhythmic and hypnotic, creating an island of sound that isolated us from the rest of the world. The power flickered and died, plunging the living room into a soft, gray twilight. Kenneth didn't reach for his phone or a flashlight. Instead, he helped me out of my chair and onto the thick rug by the cold fireplace, surrounding me with every pillow in the house until I was propped up and comfortable. Being out of the chair felt strange. I felt smaller, more vulnerable, but also more accessible. We were inches apart in the semi-darkness. The sound of the rain seemed to amplify the sound of our breathing. I felt his hand find mine under the blanket, his fingers interlacing with mine. The warmth of his palm against mine was the most grounded I had felt in years. He leaned in, and for the first time, he didn't stop at my cheek. He found my mouth. The kiss was slow, tentative at first, tasting of the rainy air and suppressed longing. I reached up, my fingers tangling in the short hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer until his weight was a glorious heavy pressure against my chest. His other hand slid under my shirt, his palm hot against the small of my back, drawing a line of fire up my spine. "I've been wanting to do that since the first week," he groaned against my lips before diving back in, his tongue tracing the line of my teeth until I was breathless and dizzy. That night, the floor of my living room felt more solid than any skyscraper I had ever built.
The transition from nursing to loving culminated on an evening that felt charged with the electricity of an approaching storm. Before dinner, Kenneth decided I needed to see myself, really see myself, through his eyes. He brought a large, floor-length mirror from the hallway and propped it up in front of the bed. "Look at yourself, Harry," he commanded softly, standing behind me as he helped me out of my daytime clothes. I tried to look away, the sight of my pale, thin legs always a source of bitter shame. I felt like a ruin, a skyscraper that had collapsed before it was finished, leaving only the jagged rebar of my spine. But Kenneth caught my chin, forcing me to look. He stood behind me, his dark, muscular frame a stark contrast to my own. He began to kiss my shoulders, his hands roaming over my chest, watching my reaction in the glass. "See what I see," he whispered, his mouth moving to the sensitive spot behind my ear. "See the way your skin glows in this light. See how your body reacts when I touch you here." His hands slid down to my waist, his thumbs hooking into the waistband of my boxers. He pulled me back against him, and I saw the raw, naked desire in his eyes reflected in the mirror. It wasn't pity, it was hunger. He leaned down and bit my shoulder softly, his eyes never leaving mine in the glass. "You are not a tragedy, Harry. You are a masterpiece, and masterpieces deserve to be worshipped, not just maintained." The stew Kenneth cooked afterward tasted like fire and spice, but it was nothing compared to the heat in the room. He picked out a silk shirt I hadn't worn since before the accident, a deep emerald green that caught the light of the candles. The intimacy of him dressing me was almost unbearable. He knelt between my legs to pull on my trousers, his head inches from my lap, his fingers working the zipper with a focused intensity. Then he stood to button the shirt. His fingers moved up from my waist to my throat, his knuckles occasionally brushing against my bare skin. He lingered at the top button, his gaze dropping to my lips. "You look incredible tonight, Harry," he whispered. Throughout dinner, the candlelight cast long, flickering shadows. We spoke about the future, about buildings I might still design, about the world beyond the four walls of this house. But the subtext was deafening. Every time our eyes met, I saw a reflection of my own hunger, a structural need for connection that went deeper than bone. I realized then that Kenneth was falling, and I was falling right along with him, tumbling into a void I thought I'd never see again. The bath that followed was the breaking point. The steam curled around us, and the scent of sandalwood was intoxicating. Kenneth was kneeling by the tub, his shirt discarded, his bronze skin glistening with moisture. As he washed my back, his hands moved in agonizingly slow, rhythmic circles. He was focused, his muscles rippling with every movement, his gaze never leaving mine in the glass. "Lean forward," he murmured. I obeyed, resting my forehead against his shoulder. I could feel the heat radiating from him, a physical force. Every time his skin brushed mine, a jolt of fire shot through me. I reached back, catching his forearm, my nails digging into his skin. "Kenneth," I whispered, "please, for tonight, stop being my nurse, stop being my caregiver, just for an hour. Just be mine. I'm tired of being a patient. I want to be a man." He leaned forward, his chest pressing against my damp back, his heart thudding against my shoulder blades like a trapped bird. "I haven't felt like your nurse in a long time, Harry. I haven't felt like anything but a man wanting another man for a month. I've been drowning in you."
He turned me in the water, his mouth finding mine with a desperation that mirrored my own. The kiss was deep, wet, and filled with a year's worth of unspoken longing. His hands, usually so careful, were now possessive as they roamed over my shoulders and chest, claiming every inch of me. The water splashed over the sides of the tub, but neither of us cared. "I want you," I gasped against his lips. "Every part of me, the parts that work and the parts that don't, all the broken pieces." Kenneth let out a low, guttural growl. He reached into the water and lifted me out of the tub in one fluid, powerful motion. He didn't use the hoist. He didn't use the sling. He held me against his chest, my wet skin slick against his, and carried me to the bedroom as if I were the most precious thing he had ever touched. He laid me on the bed in the moonlight. When he joined me, the world narrowed down to the taste of him: salt, sweat, and desire. He explored every inch of me with a curiosity that made me feel powerful, not fragile. He didn't shy away from my body. He celebrated it. He kissed the surgical scars on my hips with a reverence that brought tears to my eyes. He massaged the legs that couldn't move until I felt the ghost of a tingle deep in my marrow, a psychological echo of pleasure that was more intense than anything I'd felt before the accident. We drowned in each other that night, proving that desire doesn't need a spine to stand on, and that intimacy can build a structure more enduring than any skyscraper. In the dark, I wasn't disabled. I was simply loved.
The morning after was the start of a new map, a way of navigating a world that was no longer divided into caretaker and patient. The sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting stripes across the bed where we lay tangled together. "I have to quit the agency," Kenneth said, his hand resting possessively on my thigh, his thumb drawing slow, rhythmic circles. "I can't be your employee if I'm going to be the man who wakes up next to you every morning. I want to be the one who chooses to be here, not the one who's paid to be." "I've already handled it," I told him, a genuine smile finally reaching my eyes. "I hired a morning crew for the heavy lifting and the clinical stuff. I don't want you to have to be the one who does the maintenance anymore. I want you to be the one who does the rest. I want you to be my partner, not my porter." "The rest?" he teased, a glint in his eye. "The love," I said firmly. "The arguments, the movie nights, the permanent everything else shift. For the rest of our lives. I want to build something with you, Kenneth. Something that won't fall down when the weather gets rough." Our romance became a series of defiant, beautiful dates that challenged the world to look at us. There was the art gallery date in November, where Kenneth pushed me through a crowded exhibit. When a man made a snide comment about the chair blocking the view of a sculpture, Kenneth didn't yell. He just stepped close to the man, his presence so imposing and protective that the stranger withered and apologized. Kenneth looked at me then and winked, then leaned down and kissed me right there in front of everyone, a long, deep, "we own this room" kind of kiss that made my heart soar. It was the first time I felt proud in public since the accident. There was the Christmas Eve date, where we built a roaring fire that smelled of pine and cedar. I had saved all of Sarah's old letters, the ones where she blamed me for ruining her life with my accident, the ones that had been poison to my soul. Together we fed them to the flames, one by one. As the paper curled and turned to ash, I felt the last of the shame evaporate into the chimney. We replaced those bitter memories with new ones, dancing in the living room, him holding me upright, my feet resting on his heavy boots, swaying to the sound of the snow hitting the glass. He kissed me then, a slow, sweet taste of pine and promise, and for those moments I was 6 feet tall again. But the most significant date happened in late spring. Kenneth drove me back to my old architecture firm. I hadn't stepped foot in the building in over 2 years. I was terrified that they would see a ruin, just as Sarah had. But as Kenneth pushed me through the lobby, he held my head high. I didn't go back to work as an employee.
I went back as a consultant. I sat in the boardroom, Kenneth standing right behind me, his hand resting on my shoulder. I presented a new blueprint, a community center designed with universal access as its core, not as an afterthought. For the first time, I used my horizontal perspective to build something vertical. The intimate moments, though, remained the quietest ones. On our anniversary date in the garden, a year after he first walked through my door, Kenneth stood behind me as I pruned the vibrant blue hydrangeas. Throughout the spring, he had spent his weekends building high, reinforced raised beds so I could garden from my chair. He reached around to guide my hands, his chest warm against my back, his breathing steady. "Look at this," I whispered, touching a bloom that was heavy with color. "I thought they'd never survive the winter. I thought the frost would take everything. I thought I was done for." "Of course they did," Kenneth said, kissing the side of my neck. "They just needed someone who wasn't afraid of a little extra work to keep them blooming. They just needed someone to see the potential in the soil, even when it looked like nothing was growing. You're a builder, Harry. You should know that you can't have a beautiful garden without getting your hands dirty and tending to the roots." My life is still measured in still points, but the silence is gone. It's been replaced by Kenneth's laughter, the heat of his skin against mine, and the knowledge that being still is just another way of being present. I looked down at his hands, the hands that had bathed me when I was a bitter stranger, carried me when I felt broken, and loved me back into existence. "I love you, Ken," I said, leaning my head back against his chest. He squeezed me tight, his voice thick with that same resonance I'd fallen for on that first Tuesday morning. "I've got you, Harry, on every date, in every room, for the rest of the way. I've got you, and I'm never letting go." He turned me in my chair then, kneeling down so we were eye to eye. He took my face in both of his large, warm hands, hands that were steady, strong, and entirely mine, and kissed me with a depth that told me everything I needed to know about the future. In the end, it wasn't about being fixed. It was about being found by a man who wasn't afraid of the stillness and who knew that even a broken architect could still build something beautiful if he had the right foundation. We were ruins, perhaps, but we were ruins standing together, and in that, there was a strength that no skyscraper could ever hope to match.